Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about a very odd shortlist in Booker Prize history, and that is the 1975 one. And it's odd for several reasons, but the main and most sort of visible reason is the size of that shortlist. These are the only two books on it. And this is partly sort of an historical, well, the kind of rumours / sort of what's now been released about it, reason behind it is kind of a bit wild, really. So the judges typically in those times didn't have a long list. They would just pick their short list of 6 or sometimes 4 or 5 as it was. And the judges that year were given all the books to read and were kind of told to come to a decision. But all of the judges basically collectively came to a decision that Heat and Dust by Ruth, Prawer, Jhabvala was the winner. They all read it and loved it so much that they couldn't see any other book beating it. So in their mind, they saw no reason to create a shortlist because it would be giving almost a false sense of hope to those other authors, and kind of creating a buzz around the idea that any other book could win when they'd already chosen their winner. And they loved this book so much that they just thought, well, that's it, that's our winner. If we're all agreed on it, that it's the winner, this is just a waste of time. The Booker panel were not happy about this, understandably, because it kind of threw the whole thing out. If this was only the prize started in 1969, this was only what, the 7th year maybe that they were running the prize. And so they didn't want this much of an upset this early on that they'd completely, break with the tradition. So they forced the judges to consider a shortlist. The judges were not, they sort of thought, well, this is kind of ridiculous. We've got our winner, but fine, let's pick another book. And so they chose one more. Thomas Kenneally's got The Gossip in the Forest, From the Forest. And so that was their shortlist. They apparently were not budged any further on that because they still only had these 2 books. And so we have the shortest shortlist in Booker history so far. And even then, even if it were just on average page length, this is still probably the shortest shortlist ever. Heat and Dust is just under 200 pages. Thomas Kenneally's book is just over 200 pages. Between them, this is a very slight shortlist regardless. And so that's kind of how we ended up with this very odd case. But now let's go in and talk about the books a little bit themselves. So first up, let's do the winner, Ruth Prawer Jhabvala's Heat and Dust. And so this is largely focused on a young woman who looks over her life and wants to go back and basically understand her mother's life. Her mother being a British woman who'd moved to India and had lived her life there. And so the opening part of the book really is the mother's life, and we learn a lot about what was happening for her, and this sort of interesting dynamic that she had to play to balance everything that's going on around her. So she would benefit from being white and particularly being from the UK in India, which had been a British colony, and there were all these kinds of things around that. So there are kind of these interesting ways that she moves through the world, but she's also somebody who's learned Hindi and can therefore get around and do things, and so she's not quite as passive as maybe some of the other people around her, and so she lives this quite interesting life, and she is able to move through it, to kind of have a sense of what it means to live in this very odd time, particularly as things were rapidly changing sort of towards the end of the British Empire, and particularly the sort of British control over India was sort of waning. And so this is really interesting. And so this book is almost then a recast of what does it look like after the empire for somebody to come in and try to pick up the pieces of what their mother's life was. And it's interesting because this sort of life is something that the daughter can't fully understand, and she spends so much of her time outside, kind of trying to unpick the smallest clues. Meanwhile, her mother was sort of living this life where she would kind of, there was a very amorous sort of man in a temple. This is my resounding memory of the book. And this sort of interesting life, but there's a real quiet grace and power to this book. It's a surprisingly quiet book, given everything that goes on in it. And for me, I just think really well observed. I can see why the judges would have picked it as their winner. There's something about the characterization, about the crafting of this novel, about the really poignant way that it captures voice and that it captures a sort of very specific moment in time, that I just think is really gorgeous. I think it's a really special book. And I think particularly it's interesting, I think, for the book of books in the 70s and 80s, because so often they feel really defined by men writing these big historical books that are very daring in certain ways, and women writing these really astute character studies that are so quietly devastating and poignant. But because they're so quiet, maybe often got lost in the hubbub of everything else. So I think this is a really special novel. It's really quite poignant, and I just really enjoyed what it did. So I see completely why this would have been a winner, although maybe not enough of a winner to have completely eradicated a whole shortlist. But there we go. And so the other book on this shortlist is Thomas Kenneally's Gossip from the Forest. And this is a really quite beautiful book, I think, in many ways as well. So it is a book that is set just at the end of World War One, as a few diplomats from several countries involved in the war are trying to come together to negotiate the terms of peace. And I think already that's quite an interesting place to an interesting sort of time to place the novel in, because it really involves a lot of thinking about what those moments would have looked like. And I think what I really appreciate about this book, and about a lot of his novels actually, I think he's quite an interesting author for his historical fiction range. Confederates being about the Confederate Army in the US. He also wrote Schindler's Ark, then later turned into Schindler's List. He has this really interesting range of sort of history that he calls on and digs into. And here I think what's really quite special is he sort of summons these characters up, and they're kind of people you don't really think about. Typically you'll think about the key politicians who will have announced those decisions. And so we get the beginning, like Clemenceau and a few other politicians, but it's really the diplomats at the heart of this book. And they have these interactions where we keep on remembering that they are just men. They are sort of real humans. They are trying to negotiate these historically, these very big and sort of ridiculously abstract and absurd decisions that will impact history for hundreds of years. And they're doing so kind of as just ordinary people trying to come together to negotiate these terms. And what kind of comes out of it is just the kind of complexities of what that looks like when we really break it down. That history is often told by the sort of the victors, but here are these diplomats trying to really do their best. One of them mentions having a foreign wife, which complicates things because it's a French wife, and trying to negotiate terms around that is complicated. To kind of think that if you're punishing one country, that's also the country that your wife is attached to. These people are not isolated individuals who can just think completely clearly. At one point, one of them is talking to a chef, and the chef mentions one of their children dying in the war. And that feels quite profound for the other character, for the diplomat hearing it, because he sort of again is made to think of the fact that the history of the war has really affected people, and it's not as simple a decision as just, okay, go on, do it, you're fine. There's so much more that's at stake here. And so I think that's what's really quite beautiful and special about this book, is the way that it really seeks to give a voice and give understanding to the impossibility of this decision, that we're asking people to just go and negotiate the terms of countries, but also what other way is there? What other options are there apart from people doing this? And so, yeah, I think it's really quite special as well. So a really interesting shortlist despite its small size. And I think that's what is so interesting for me about this 2-book shortlist, is that there could have been so much potential for this to just be 2 duds. And actually it's quite a streamlined shortlist for that reason. They all had one book that they agreed on, which is not always common in Booker Prize judging. And they had another book that they all agreed on enough to think to sort of say could probably take a second place, and basically be given the runner-up trophy without it being announced as such immediately. And so there we go. We end up with this 2-book shortlist that I think has 2 very interesting looks at historical fiction, and particularly at telling the stories of war and the end of war in some really quite special ways. So anyway, there we go. That's yeah, something quite interesting here. I hope you've enjoyed this shortlist. A very, very short one, a significantly easier shortlist for me to read, hence why I'm squeezing it in now while I'm reading some of the chunkers for 2008. But anyway, I've been Bob the Bookerer talking about these books for the shortlist. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.